Hey there, so I've been working on the various videos I want to make for this series, and I wasn't quite sure where to fit the stuff that I'm going to talk about in this video, and I was kind of struggling on how to fit it in, but then I realized like this is my channel, I can do whatever I want, so screw it, I'm just going to make it its own video. So that's what this video is. And it might seem kind of silly, I guess, maybe to have like a video, anyone who's going to watch this knows what cryptography is, you're probably familiar with functions. But I still wanted to go over it because I think it's just helpful from a foundational view. Like the more organized or kind of concrete these things are in your mind, I think it's going to help with the mountain of other things that are going to get thrown at you. It'll help them stick just a little bit better if you have a framework that's maybe a little more organized or just a little more, I don't know, solid. So that's kind of the point of this video, or at least the goal. Whether or not it's actually the case, I don't know, I guess we'll see. So cryptography, crypt coming from the Greek word for secret. So cryptography literally means secret writing. And when we mention cryptography, the first thing that kind of comes to mind is encryption and decryption. And I'm not a historian of cryptography, but I imagine that historically that was pretty much its only use. You had a message you wanted to send to somebody, but it had to travel a great distance, and you didn't want to intercept it and someone else to be able to access that information. So you came up with a way to encrypt it. The person on the other end could decrypt it, but anyone in the middle hopefully just saw it as nonsense. But with modern cryptography, we actually get a lot more. There's a lot more under the umbrella of cryptography. We have the ability to authenticate identities. We can ensure the integrity of the data that's been transmitted and that hasn't been tampered with. And there's also non-repudiation, which basically is just someone not being able to deny that the message originated from them. So kind of similar to authentication, but a little different, a little subtle difference. And so with all these things under the umbrella of cryptography, there's much more to it than just encryption and decryption. We have digital signatures and hash functions and pseudo-random number generators. There's a lot more to it than just the act of encrypting and decrypting. And so modern cryptography is kind of built around Kirchhoff's principle. So August Kirchhoff was a Dutch cryptographer, and he's kind of famous for his philosophy. One of the things he said was that the system must not be required to be secret. It must be able to fall into the hands of an enemy without inconvenience. So if you've heard of the term like security through obscurity, and often in a negative connotation, like that's kind of what that's about. Like we want to have our adversary understand absolutely everything about the system and it still is secure, as opposed to the reason it's secure is because no one can figure out what it's actually doing. And the reason I bring this up, besides it just being kind of like the sort of fundamental principle of modern cryptography, is also a lot of the challenges that you're going to be doing and solving in CTFs and stuff are because of this philosophy. Like you're going to be exploiting weaknesses that other people have found in the protocols and systems that we currently use. And the finding of and exploiting of those weaknesses is ultimately what makes the system as a whole more secure, because it's better to use something that tens of thousands of the brightest minds have looked at and tried to figure out how to break, than to use something that it's just secure because no one kind of smart has looked at it yet and figured out a way to break it. And so that whole process is kind of what leads to a lot of the crypto challenges that we have to work on, is because someone figured out how to break it. And then we're going to figure out what it is they figured out and how to apply it. So the other thing I want to talk about is kind of the two distinct types of cryptography, your symmetric and your asymmetric. So symmetric is where the key to encrypt is the same as the key to decrypt. So you'll sometimes see it called secret key cryptography. AES would be the prime example of this. Now, the advantages of symmetric over asymmetric is that symmetric is a lot faster. Modern processors, for example, have AES instructions built right into the CPU. But the problem is that the sender and the receiver both need to know the secret key. Now, it's not really a big deal if you're just encrypting your own hard drive, right? But you're essentially both the sender and the receiver. But if I want to send you a message, then I need a way to get you the secret key. And if I have a way to securely send you that secret key, then why don't I just use that to send the actual messages? So that's kind of where asymmetric cryptography comes into play. You'll see it called public key cryptography sometimes. And I'm sure you can guess this is where the key to encrypt is different from the key to decrypt. So if you're familiar with RSA, that would be like an example of that. You've got a public key anyone can use to encrypt messages to send to you, and you're the only one who'll be able to decrypt and read them because you're the only one with the private key. Now, they're built around complex math, and there's a lot more overhead. The keys are big, and so it's a lot slower than something like AES. But they can be used to overcome the problem of how to send a message through an insecure channel. So like if you've heard of the Diffie-Hellman key exchange, for example, things like that allow us to where I can send you information over an insecure channel. You can communicate back to me information through that same insecure channel. And that information we shared will allow us to agree upon a secret key. But anybody who was able to intercept all of that traffic and could read all the information that we shared with each other doesn't give them any advantage in trying to figure out what that shared secret key is. So, I mean, basically that's how the internet gets down, right? That's how HTTPS and TSL and all that stuff, that's after the connection's established, there's basically a procedure to agree upon a protocol and the exchanging of information that gets a mutually shared secret key, which is then used to encrypt the rest of the traffic, which is in AES because it's a lot faster. And asymmetric cryptography also gives us the ability to do some of these other things we've talked about, that I mentioned, like digital signatures and things of that nature. The other thing I wanted to go over was functions. This obviously is an example of a function, but most of what you see is just convention. There's nothing special about F or G or H or whatever name you commonly see. There's nothing special about X. It's just the convention we use. We could just as easily have a function that was a lightning bolt symbol for a name and a pig nose for an input. Like both of these are equally valid. But the reason that I'm not putting this stuff in a math video is that I don't want to just sit here and give you the definition of a function and talk about surjections and injections and how they relate to cryptography, because I think ultimately it'll be way more helpful to not even have to worry about any of that at all. And I think we can save ourselves from a lot of mental overhead if we think about functions as just a black box, because ultimately that's all a function is. It's just something that takes inputs and it gives you an output. And I'm not sure if I think this is most helpful, because at one point I actually really struggled with functions. I don't know if it was the different symbols I wasn't used to or what, but I had a hard time getting them to stick in my head. I think that's actually how I found Khan Academy. I was looking for a way to practice problems dealing with functions because it just didn't make sense to me. But once I kind of ultimately just sort of realized oh, it's just this essentially a machine, right? You give it an input and it gives you an output, and what's actually going on in that inside just depends on the function. And I think thinking about a function in this model, kind of in its simplest form, is actually going to be really helpful for us. Cryptography is built on functions, so they're everywhere, and specifically they're built on one-way functions. So we have something that is efficient for us in one direction, like we can give some black box of plain text and it can quickly give us an output, that's a ciphertext. But we can't go in the reverse direction efficiently. There's not a black box that we can give a ciphertext and will quickly spit out a plain text. And actually, we don't even know if one-way functions are a thing. If you've ever heard of P versus NP or P equals NP, that's what that whole problem is about, basically. And it's the biggest unsolved problem in computer science. So it's actually kind of interesting to think about what our world would look like if that isn't the case, and we did have a method for finding these efficient ways to solve problems. Like cryptography, I think basically ceases to exist. So, then what is there an internet? What does banking look like? So yeah, I don't know. But anyway, even though these functions are what everything's built on, I think we can save ourselves a lot of mental overhead and frustration by thinking about them in that more abstract state. That's one of the powerful things about programming, for example. Like here's some JavaScript function. I mean, you even declare it by writing function. And I don't think it's a coincidence that inputs to functions in most programming languages are placed between parentheses. But the power in programming comes from the abstraction these provide. Like once we create this function or copy and paste it from Stack Overflow, like we don't ever have to think about it anymore. It's essentially this black box that we give inputs, something that happens inside that does something we want, and then it gives us an output or outputs. And there's a lot of aspects of cryptography we can treat exactly like this. AES, for example, we're going to see that we can recover AES encrypted plaintexts without knowing a single thing about the inner workings of AES. Now, just like with programming, we need to know a few properties that the inputs and outputs have, right? Like knowing that the output of an AES function is supposed to be indistinguishable from random, that changing any bit in the input is completely going to change the output. So we can't make any association from ciphertexts what their inputs look like or vice versa. That's helpful, but as for how AES actually does all that, we don't need to care. And I think realizing that's what's going on as a function, but then allowing yourself to kind of be confused by how it does what it does, or not even having to worry about it, frees up your mental resources to focus on other aspects of the system, and allows us to see things we might have otherwise missed because we're too busy being frustrated by trying to figure out how that box is actually doing what it's doing. Now, I don't want to take away anything from what's actually going on in any of these functions. There's a lot of beauty and a lot of opportunity to understand things at a deeper level if you try and figure all that stuff out, if you go exploring. And there's a ton of just incredible resources out there on the internet that's going to explain all these inner workings. But the goal of this series is basically to help someone who wants to feel more comfortable with crypto challenges, somebody who just wants to have more fun and wants to solve more challenges. And I think recognizing the opportunity for abstraction and freeing your brain from some of that complication is a helpful step towards that goal. So just being able to see that it's just a black box, inputs, outputs, and if you don't quite understand how it's working, you don't have to worry about it. Don't let that frustration or that lack of knowledge keep you from being able to see I don't need to know how that works. I can still solve this problem, and solving problems feels good, and ultimately, hopefully, you'll enjoy it, and then it's just going to spur you to want to actually find out how these things work, because it actually really is beautiful how a lot of it works. So that's kind of what I wanted to ramble about, basically. Hopefully you got something helpful out of that. Hopefully I just didn't make things more confusing. Ultimately go with what works for you. But I think for me, this is the most helpful, and for a lot of people, math in general, right? It's not like I've tutored cryptography, but just helping people, math in general, seeing where they can see how oh, okay, I don't have to get this perfectly in order to see the bigger picture and understand what's actually going on. I think is really helpful. So I don't know, hopefully something like that happened. If not, hey, but yeah, if you're still watching, I hope you got something out of it. And if you wanted to hit the like or subscribe button, that makes me happy. And I definitely am working on the other content, so hopefully that stuff will be out. Something else will be out soon. Yeah, take care.